Pride is failing this year.
Organizers at Pride Toronto say this year's celebration might look a little different amid rising costs and uncertainty with corporate sponsors.
Uncertainty with corporate sponsors? I wonder why that would be.
But Kojo Modeste believes the reasons are less about money and more about cuts to DEI programming south of the border.
Okay, so you think that Donald Trump's crackdown on DEI is what's responsible for the loss in sponsorship. And I know that DEI is supposed to stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'll remind you that DEI can also stand for dumb, entitled, and incorrigible, or dirty, explicit, and indecent. So let's really get into it.
Pride Month begins with fresh challenges as organizers lose 2 more key sponsors.
2 more key sponsors?
Home Depot and Google pulling sponsorships days ago. Pride Toronto now faces a $700,000 shortfall. This includes funding lost after 3 sponsors backed out in February.
I wonder which ones you lost before. Let's do a little bit of research and see if we can find out. Okay, so I figured it out. It's Nissan, Adidas, and Clorox. So keep that in mind. Put a pin in it, as the kids would say.
I think this pullback from these corporations is really sad because it's when the times get tough that you need your friends and you need your allies to pull together for you.
I think it's really sad that you thought these corporate sponsors were your friends and allies in the first place. Corporations are there to make money. So if Pride isn't making them money, or at the very least providing them with positive brand representation, and in the end turns out to be something that they're just donating to, then it shouldn't be a surprise to you when they cut that money. I mean, did you really think that they were giving Pride money out of the goodness of their hearts, or just because they love the LGBTQ community so much? I mean, you could take all the balls that have been removed from every trans woman that's going to march in Pride Toronto, and it still wouldn't add up to the amount of balls it would take. What's up, everybody? Ty Rivera here, the absolute best LGBTQ comedian in the world. All right, so I wanted to talk about Pride Toronto, which Pride Toronto is the latest victim in the Pride Wars of 2025. And by victim, I mean they're the latest to lose sponsors. And while they would love to blame Donald Trump, the Trump administration, and a crackdown on DEI, I really feel like this is Pride Toronto and the LGBT, or I should say the
2S LGBTQ
community's way of completely skirting responsibility and refusing to acknowledge what their part has been in all of this. And I also think that Pride Toronto and all of Pride altogether, not just in Canada, not just in Toronto, but the United States and all over the world, has to understand that if you want to have corporate sponsors, you have to play by corporate rules. Because when you're dealing with corporate sponsors, not only do you have to deal with the sponsors themselves, but you also have to deal with what the consumers of those particular sponsors want to see, what the brands they buy from and support are supporting with their money. And if that doesn't add up to something that's going to be good for the brand, that's going to hurt their brand. And what's the point of them giving you money for your event if it's going to hurt their bottom line? For example, whether the LGBTQ community wants to admit it or not, right now the trans issue is very divisive. A lot of people are over the trans community. There was a point where the trans community had a lot of support. Then the trans community started going too far in wanting to have gender affirming care for minors, also in invading women's spaces and women's sports, in some cases overstepping on parental rights, and people are just over it. So what does the executive director of Pride Toronto go ahead and do? He goes ahead and puts out a statement that says this: "We're very deliberate to really showcase that the 2S LGBTQ plus community stands with the trans community because we have seen the attacks that have been directed, especially to our trans siblings," said Modeste. And to the executive director of Pride Toronto, Kojo Modeste, I would say that that's fine if that's what you want to do. But you also have to remember that if you want to double down on something that isn't even popular with lesbians, gays, and bisexuals at this point, then you have to suffer the consequences that go with that. But let's get back to blaming Donald Trump and the DEI crackdown.
I believe that it has a lot to do with what is happening in the U.S.
Home Depot Canada tells Global News, quote, "We continually review our nonprofit giving and decided not to contribute to this event this year with no agreement in place to do so," and says it will continue to participate in Pride activities. And as for Google Canada, it says, quote, "We will still be supporting Pride this year by marching in the parade," and it says it will continue to celebrate heritage and community moments, including Pride.
Okay, so if they're still supporting other Pride events, and they're very clear about that in their wording, then it would seem that this might be something that's going on specifically with Pride Toronto. And I could be off on this, but I would think that if they were really worried about blowback from the Trump administration regarding DEI, as Mr. Modeste claims, they would stop giving to or participating in all Pride events. Maybe let me know in the comments if you see what I'm saying, or if it makes sense that they would continue to support prides in general, but just not this particular pride, if the reason were actually that they were worried about consequences from the Trump administration. And while we're at it, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We're seeing how fast we can get to 100,000 subscribers. When you hit the subscribe button, make sure you click the bell and select all notifications so that you know every time I upload. Now let's get back to this story, because I feel like we might be getting closer to the real reason that this is all happening, and I'm just going to let them continue to feed us the rope.
Both companies did not say why.
These are not companies that are struggling. These are not companies that need to be tightening their belts. So I would like to know why.
First off, let me say that dye job looks horrendous, and whoever did that to your head should be charged with a hate crime. And furthermore, any friends that you have that have told you that it looks good are not your real friends and need to be cut off. But secondly, and probably more importantly as well, if anybody ever chooses to give you money for any reason, and then they decide to stop at a point for any reason, they don't owe you any kind of explanation at all. And really what you should do as a polite person is you should thank them for the years of support and move on. But not everybody's going to do that. So if you really want a why, even though the sponsors may not be willing to give it to you, I might have some suggestions. So let's get into the why right now. Last year, 2024, Pride Toronto had a controversy where naked people were marching in the parade.
You know, there's been a lot of outrage on social media about this year's Pride Parade in Toronto. It seems that certain participants went way over the top and walked the parade completely naked, exposing themselves for many to see, including kids.
And this was such a big deal and caused such public outcry that the police actually had to put out a statement about it. Toronto police say no charges were laid for public nudity at this weekend's Pride Parade, as making arrests wouldn't serve anyone's interest. Footage from the large gay rights gathering shows several naked adults, most of whom were men, marching in the streets of downtown Toronto. On the same march, a man wearing nothing but a cartoon Bugs Bunny mask and furry rabbit foot slippers hopped around while his genitals were exposed to the crowd. Another video from the Pride weekend events, billed by organizers as family-friendly, showed a naked woman slapping her backside in front of a crowd watching a drag performer on the street. So let's think about this for a second. A parade that children attend and that the
2S LGBTQ PIA+
community encourages children to attend has naked adults in the parade behaving like this. And exactly what did Pride Toronto expect that their corporate sponsors would think of this behavior, especially when you know how people are in this day and age? People will get a hold of you any way they can get a hold of you to let you know that the event that you're sponsoring is having naked adults expose themselves to minors. And I'm sure a fair amount of those messages they got ended with something like, "I'm done buying your products, do better." You have to remember, we live in a post-Dylan Mulvaney world. So after what happened with Anheuser-Busch, aka Bud Light, and Dylan Mulvaney, and they saw their sales drop by over $1 billion, I'm sure everybody else noticed that, took note and decided that they maybe needed to be a little more cautious and discerning in their support for the LGBTQ community. So I could be crazy, or maybe in my old age I'm turning into a Karen. But either way, I think it might be something worth mentioning, or at least considering. Now let's move on to something else that might be a factor. So also at Pride Toronto 2024, there was a protest that completely shut down the parade.
Now, the parade did wrap up earlier than planned after pro-Palestinian demonstrators obstructed the march.
And I don't mean they shut down for a little while like they did back in 2016 for Black Lives Matter. Never mind that, but we'll probably bring it up in a few. But there were pro-Palestine protesters that refused to let the parade go on.
They called on Pride organizers to cut ties with companies they allege are linked to Israel.
That's interesting. They called on Pride organizers to cut ties with companies they allege are linked with Israel. So what I decided to do is to go back and look at the sponsors that have pulled out. So the original 3 to pull their support were Nissan, Adidas, and Clorox. And then most recently, we have Google and Home Depot. So let's start with Nissan. First off, it's no secret that Nissan is in financial trouble. So that might be part of it, or it could at least be in part due to the fact that Nissan is owned by the Renault Group, which is the Renault Nissan Mitsubishi Alliance. So then if I Google whether or not Nissan supports Israel, what I end up finding out is that Renault Nissan Mitsubishi set up something that's called Alliance Ventures, which is a corporate capital fund. So then if you look a little bit further into that, what you end up finding out is Alliance Ventures keep investing in the Israeli automotive market. Okay. So we all know that I'm a smooth-brained American with a 9th grade education from Casa Grande, Arizona. But that, to me, sounds like they might have ties with Israel. Anyway, let's move on to Adidas. If you Google, does Adidas support Israel? One of the first things that comes up is a Reddit thread. And this is what it says. The reason to boycott Adidas is it uses Israeli manufacturer Delta Galil to manufacture its underwear range. And then I Googled a little further into that and found out that Delta Galil was actually founded in Tel Aviv. So again, from what this smooth-brained American hick was able to find, it sounds like we have another sponsor that was linked with Israel. Now let's do Clorox. And when I went ahead and Googled Clorox, the first thing I saw was a tweet that said this: I just want to remind everyone that Clorox is a brand under Procter & Gamble, a company that supports Israel and funds them. But we all know you can never trust Twitter and tweets alone. So I ended up Googling further into that, and what I ended up finding out was that there was a call for a boycott against Procter & Gamble. And the website for that boycott said this: Procter & Gamble has to be boycotted. Huge investments and support to Israel. Have a research and development center and invest Israeli-based companies as well. Strong economic support. Procter & Gamble opened an R&D center in Tel Aviv, occupied Palestine, in which it invests $2 billion annually. And even though the grammar on that was terrible, I kind of have no idea what they're saying, other than the fact that clearly Procter & Gamble, the owners of Clorox, do have links with Israel. And then on that same website, there was a link that was marked proof. And when I went to the link, what it was an entire article that Procter & Gamble had done with Forbes, where they were mentioning that Israel is the place to be. So then I went ahead and looked into Google. And the first thing to come up when I Googled, does Google support Israel, was this: Google funds Israel's wars. These investments aren't only used to compensate for war losses, but to finance the continued growth of Israel's military capabilities, including weapons and equipment used against Palestinian civilians. So I think that pretty well answers that. And now to our final sponsor, which would have been Home Depot. How is Home Depot encouraging Israel's colonial expansion? Home Depot continues to encourage Israeli colonial expansion by selling a large array of products from the Israeli company Keter Plastic and its subsidiaries, e.g. Keter Black & Decker, Loden Past Bath Mats, and Workforce. So yeah, it seems like we're in a little bit of a pickle here with the sponsors. But never fear, all is not lost, because as we all know, God never closes a door without opening a window. The protesters let the organizers of Pride Toronto know what they wanted Pride to do in these situations.
Demanding Pride Toronto boycott, divest from, and sanction institutions and corporations that support or endorse the state of quote unquote Israel, its apartheid system, and its occupation of Palestinian territories and people. Pride Toronto has yet to meet these demands and therefore has failed to denounce pinkwashing.
Okay. So, first off, I don't really know how Pride Toronto is going to boycott companies that they're getting money from, but I guess if that's what you want to do, be my guest. But I also would like to remind you that this is not a little bit of money that we're talking about.
Pride Toronto's executive director says 3 major corporate sponsors are reducing their contributions, potentially pulling out of the festival entirely, setting a shift in priorities. The expected shortfall amounts to roughly $300,000.
So that tells me that each one of them was obviously giving around $100,000. So again, boycott if you want to, but that doesn't sound like the move to me. And when the protesters say that Pride Toronto has failed to divest from or place sanctions upon these corporations, that's where I begin to wonder if the protesters know what these words mean. Because to divest means deprive someone of power, rights, or possessions. So exactly what rights or power do you think that you're going to be able to deprive these corporations of? The power and the right to give Pride money? And again, maybe I'm crazy, but I'm not seeing how that's going to hurt them. And for anybody that doesn't know, sanctions are financial and trade-related penalties imposed by one country on another entity. So just to get this straight, you're proposing that they financially penalize corporations that are already giving them money. I mean, you could take all the balls that have been removed from every trans woman that's going to march in Pride Toronto, and it still wouldn't add up to the amount of balls it would take for these protesters to think that Pride Toronto could ask these corporations for money to throw a party, because that's what Pride is at this point, is it's a party.
Pride is a protest.
And I don't care what anybody tells you.
Pride will always be a protest.
Pride is a party.
But Pride is a celebration.
Close enough, and I appreciate you admitting that. But as I was saying, that's what Pride is a party. And these protesters have the balls to think that these corporations are going to deal with sanctions in order to pay for your party. And I really just can't wrap my head around it, because really that is exactly what they're saying. That in order to have the privilege of giving us money for our party, you have to give us more money. And then on top of that, you think that you're going to be able to tell these corporations who and what else they can give money to? Make it make sense, please. And the pink washing is something I'm really tired of hearing about, because you can't have it both ways. You can't say that you want people to support LGBTQ and then call it pink washing and vilify it when people actually do. Because for anybody that's not familiar with what pink washing is, I'll read that definition to you really quick. Pink washing is a critical term used to refer to the practice of attempting to benefit from purported support for LGBTQ plus rights, often as a way to profit or to distract from a separate agenda, which is something they always accuse Israel of in the Israel-Palestine debate and LGBT, which I'm not going to get into my personal feelings right now on Israel and Palestine, even though some people will tell you
the war that is currently being fought in Gaza is impacting all of our lives.
As much as you let it, because I feel fine. But the reason I'm not going to get into my personal opinions when it comes to that right now is because it really doesn't matter for this. All I'm trying to do is illustrate that maybe all of this doesn't necessarily have to do with Donald Trump and his crackdown on DEI. There may be other contributing factors as to why sponsors aren't willing to deal with Pride. And I'm not really sure how these protesters think that scaring off sponsors is a good idea. I mean, could you imagine if they end up effectively scaring off all of their major sponsors, where that will leave Pride Toronto?
80% of Pride's budget comes from sponsorship. 15% comes from government. and 5% come from donations.
And these protesters are too stupid to realize what a disservice they do, not only to Pride, but the LGBTQ movement in general, when they do these kinds of things. And understand, Pride Toronto has a history of these kinds of things happening.
I think of the 2016 case where Black Lives Matter disrupted. There was a sit-in for about half an hour, but that ended with the parade continuing.
But then another interesting tidbit is the current executive director of Pride Toronto, this guy, Kojo Modeste, was actually a part of the sit-in that happened back in 2016.
And I will tell you something, and I'm saying this on national television. I was in the sit-in. I was in that sit-in with Black Lives Matter.
So in a sense, this is a case of you reap what you sow, and enjoy being a part of what made these people feel empowered to do what they did in 2024 and will continue to do until you just completely bend their will 100%. But to get back to how this hurts all of Pride, the executive director said that they were about 75% done with the parade when the protesters decided to shut it down. Or I should say, when the organizers decided to shut it down because of the protesters, because they began to worry that there may be a safety concern at play. And even though 75% is 3/4 of the parade out of the way, there's still the remaining 25% that got screwed over.
How many people were still expected to march, if you can tell us, that were either unable to or turned back early?
We had just around 67 groups that were still needed to go through the entire parade route. That opportunity was denied to them.
And those people that you screwed over were other LGBT people that had designed floats, possibly traveled to be in the parade. Then in a lot of cases, there's the local LGBT businesses that walk in Pride. Some of them got screwed over, I'm sure. Then there's the local LGBT businesses that are actually on the parade route that could have been making extra money during that time. You hurt them as well.
Many of the businesses on Church Street will tell you that they make over 40% of their income, their annual income, on Pride weekend.
And I don't know if Pride in Canada is the same as Pride in the United States. I would imagine it is. But each one of those groups actually pays to be part of the parade. Not to mention the amount of money that sometimes it costs to put a float together if they decide to have a float. And I'm curious to know, did those groups get refunded? Did they just get screwed over? Or did they get rolled over to the following year? Because whether or not the protesters realize it, things like this make businesses and groups less likely to pay the entry fee next year to appear in the parade because they know that something like this could possibly happen again. So that's just another way that this group of protesters has hurt Pride's ability to make money. So you've hurt with the corporate sponsors, you're hurting with local businesses, you're hurting when it comes to the festival being able to make money off the parade. And also, let's not forget that in a lot of cases, these same sponsors that have paid these huge amounts of money to be featured in Pride will have sponsored floats on the parade route. So let's say that some of those got cut off, the ones that were big budget sponsors from 2024, they didn't get seen in the parade. So what happens with them? They just get screwed over. So again, how likely do you think it is that these corporate sponsors are going to be happy with what's going on any front when it comes to Pride? So you've got naked people in front of children. You're supporting trans, which right now is a terrible look. You want to be able to tell the sponsors where and who they can give money to outside of your event. You want sponsors to deal with your boycotts and pay sanctions in order to give you money, and it won't even be an enjoyable or safe experience because the parade gets shut down. Not to mention that it also looks like it could be a security risk at that point. Not to mention that tourists come from all over the world and all over the country to be a part of Pride Toronto. Pride Toronto is one of the biggest prides in the world. So you've got tourists coming as well. Then you've got the people that just wanted to watch the parade, maybe got there super early so they could get a good spot. How likely do you think a lot of those people are to come back? How much exactly do you think that you hurt this particular festival? And do you think it was worth it to do it for Palestine of all things? Where when it comes to Palestine and the people of Gaza, Palestinian people have already said that they do not want the support of the LGBTQ community community, or even if the LGBTQ community supports them, they still consider what the LGBTQ community does to be an abomination, and they have no problem doing something like launching you off a building. But you're willing to ruin a festival and an organization's opportunity to be able to make money and raise visibility for the community that you supposedly love, to show loyalty or support for people that wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire and might have actually been the ones to set you on fire in the first place. But what I'm trying to get at in all of this is the 2S LGBTQ community doesn't realize that they're making a huge mistake, not only with the way that they're conducting themselves, not only with the way that they're allowing people to represent the LGBTQ community in these situations where all of the things that I mentioned are happening, but at the end of it all, it's even more insulting, and it tells you even more that they've learned absolutely nothing, because the executive director of Pride Toronto says that they're still willing to sit down with the pro-Palestine protesters and see what they can work out or what they can figure out.
I'm more than happy to have that conversation, but for me, it was not the time and place for that.
And that makes no sense to me at all, because if you keep up with this channel, or if you pay attention to any of the other channels that talk about this kind of stuff, like Blair White or Ariel Scarcella or several others, there's Mikey, I can't remember his name right now, but I really like him. He's a really funny guy. He does content like that too, but they're all LGBT people. They are legitimately LGBT people from the community. And because their message or the questions they ask will maybe challenge people a little bit, and none of the three that I'm describing right now are at all disrespectful or a danger to other LGBT people, but because their ideas are considered dangerous or disruptive, they are getting kicked out of Pride events on the regular. They are very much not welcomed at Pride events. Or most recently, LGB people who want to be separate from the TQ have been told that their voices aren't welcomed at certain Pride. So lesbian, gay, and bisexual that aren't necessarily with the crazy that's the T and the Q and the plus are being told that they can't attend events or can't speak or need to keep their opinions to themselves. But pro-Palestine here is completely fine to shut the parade down, ruin the festivities for everybody, and they're still welcomed with open arms. Not only are they welcomed with open arms, Pride is willing to sit down with them to see what they can do to appease them. And that's another reason that Pride deserves everything it gets when it comes to these kinds of situations, because you are encouraging the bullshit. It's bad enough that you are a level of bullshit on your own, but you're encouraging bullshit from so many different directions and in so many different ways. How could you think that people were going to want to continue to support these kinds of things? And do you think that none of the people involved with distributing the money or deciding where the money is going to go when it comes to these corporate sponsors has any idea what's going on in the streets or what's going on with the LGBTQ community in general? Do you think they don't have access to the internet? Do you think they don't know that there are a lot of people like myself that are supposedly from the community that no longer support what it is Pride is doing? And so for these corporations, with things going on the way they are in the economy, and you start looking at it as far as, okay, what is it that we're doing here that's wasteful spending or unnecessary spending or diminishing returns, as in we actually put out this money and we don't get a good return on investment, or we don't even look good in supporting these things anymore, and Pride turns out to be one of those things. You can't blame that on Donald Trump. You can't blame that on homophobia. You can't blame that on DEI. The only thing to blame that on, LGBTQ plus activists, is yourselves and what you've let not only the movement but Pride itself turn into. Anyway, that's where I'm at on it. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. If you want to see my video about children being detained by ICE and everybody acting like it's so traumatic, but me feeling like you really need to blame the parents for that, click the video on your screen. Other than that, as always, thank you for watching. This has been Ty Rivera, the absolute best LGBTQ comedian in the world.
They bought into his bullshit.